So what on earth does a 16th century religious movement have to do with the birth of modern science? I mean, you'd think they're from completely different planets, right? Well, according to the work of Dutch theologian Abraham Kuyper, there's actually a deep and, honestly, a pretty surprising connection. We're going to unpack this idea that a centuries-old worldview didn't just, exist alongside science. It actually helped kickstart the whole thing.
But first, let me ask you something. If you think about the greatest possible reward for just unbelievable courage, for incredible sacrifice, what pops into your head? Gold? Land? Maybe a fancy title? Just hang on to that thought, because the answer we're looking for comes from one of the most brutal moments in European history.
Okay, picture this. The year is 1574. The Dutch city of Leiden is totally surrounded, locked in this desperate struggle for survival against the Spanish army. And this isn't just some battle over a piece of land. This is a fight for freedom, for their very way of life.
Inside the city walls, things are, well, they're horrific. The food is gone, completely gone. People are pushed to the absolute edge of what a human can endure. They're eating dogs, they're eating rats, anything to stay alive.
And if starvation wasn't bad enough, the plague, the Black Death, starts ripping through the city. It kills a third of everyone who's left. I mean, the situation is way beyond grim. It's apocalyptic.
So the Spanish, they offer them a deal. Surrender and we'll pardon you. But their response? It's one of the most incredible things you'll ever read. They basically say, we would rather eat our own left arms and keep fighting with our right than give up our freedom and our faith. Just, wow, that's how deep their conviction was.
And you know what? They held on. Against all odds, the siege was lifted, and Holland was saved. So for this unbelievable act of heroism, what was their grand prize? It wasn't treasure, it wasn't land, it wasn't some fancy title.
Their reward was a university, the University of Leiden, a school of the sciences. I mean, just think about that for a second. After going through hell on earth, the highest, most valuable prize they could possibly imagine was a place to learn.
And that brings us right to the heart of it. Why? What kind of belief system, what kind of worldview makes someone value knowledge and science so much that it becomes the ultimate prize for heroism? Well, according to Kuyper, the answer is found in the principles of Calvinism.
So Kuyper's first big idea is this. For science to even get off the ground, you have to believe the universe makes sense. The belief that there's a fixed divine plan behind everything is what makes discovery feel not just possible, but logical.
It all starts with this concept called God's decree. Now, this isn't just a fuzzy idea that someone created things. No, it's the radical belief that the entire cosmos, from a planet's orbit to the rise and fall of an empire, is all part of one single coherent, divinely ordered plan. Nothing is random.
I mean, look at the two options here. If you live in a world of pure chance, science is basically impossible. You can't discover a law of gravity if gravity might just decide to work differently tomorrow. All you can do is write down a list of random things that happened. But in a world of order, a world that runs on consistent principles, now you can investigate, you can predict, you can actually understand the system. So which world are you going to bet on if you're a scientist?
And this brings us to a really crucial point. For science to even exist, you have to start with the assumption that the universe can be understood. Kuyper uses this brilliant analogy. You can't study the architecture of a random pile of rocks, but you can study a building. Believing the universe was this grand, ordered building with a consistent style, well, that was the ultimate motivation to go out there and try to figure out its blueprints. Okay, so Kuyper's second point builds right on top of that. It's about how this worldview actually reclaimed the physical world itself, giving people what you might call spiritual permission to go out and study everything.
So before the Reformation, there was often this really sharp divide between the sacred and the secular. The thinking was, your soul matters, but the physical world? That's secondary, maybe even a distraction. But Calvinism came along and just rejected that whole idea. It argued for unity. The entire creation, from a tiny flower to a distant star, is God's handiwork. And all of a sudden, studying botany or astronomy wasn't a distraction from God, it was another way of reading his other book, the book of nature.
This whole idea was backed up by a key doctrine called common grace. You see, the question was, if humanity is fundamentally flawed, how does the world still produce so much that's good and beautiful? Art, philosophy, amazing acts of courage. Common grace was the answer. It's this idea that God's grace holds back the worst effects of evil in the world, allowing culture and order and beauty to flourish, even in societies that aren't explicitly Christian.
Kuyper had this great analogy of a wild beast.
He said common grace works in 3 ways. First, it cages sin, stopping total chaos. Second, it tames our wilder spirits. And third, it domesticates us, making things like society and civilization even possible. This gives a real dignity and value to everything humans do, whether it's explicitly religious or not. This leads to a really powerful new way of seeing the relationship between faith and nature. John Calvin said that Scripture works like a pair of glasses. It doesn't replace the book of nature, it just helps us read it correctly. So investigating the natural world wasn't a distraction from God anymore, it was a way to see His handiwork in high definition. So you have this new mindset, and it leads to Kuyper's third big point. For science to really take off, it needed freedom. And this worldview, well, it provided the philosophical dynamite to break the chains that were holding it back. By challenging the whole idea of a single, all-powerful church authority, this movement basically broke the old power structure. It argued that the church, the state, and yes, science could all operate in their own separate spheres. This new independence lets science stand on its own 2 feet, as a kind of third power in society. And it's exactly why places like the Netherlands became a safe harbor for thinkers like René Descartes, who were running from persecution in other parts of Europe.
And that brings us to Kuyper's final, and maybe his most radical claim. He argues that the real conflict isn't between faith and science. No, he says it's between 2 fundamentally different kinds of science.
So on one side, you've got what he calls the normalists. They see the universe as this normal, closed system that's just evolving on its own. Any problems are just imperfections that we can solve through natural progress. But on the other side, you've got the abnormalists. They believe the universe is not in its normal state, that it was created good but is now broken or fallen. For them, the problem isn't just imperfection, it's a deep rupture in reality that needs a supernatural solution. The amazing insight here is that these 2 groups don't just get different answers. They start from 2 totally different articles of faith about what reality even is.
And this just completely reframes that classic science versus faith debate, doesn't it? Kuyper's ultimate point is that every scientist, whether they're religious or not, starts with a fundamental belief, a faith, about how the world works. So the real conflict isn't faith versus science. It's the science of the normalists versus the science of the abnormalists. And they're both rooted in 2 totally irreconcilable starting points.
And that leaves us with a really provocative question for our own time. If Kuyper is right, if all science really does start with an act of faith about the nature of reality, what's the faith that's driving the science of today?